I need to start this one with an honest admission, because I think that's the only way into this topic that actually respects you as a viewer. For a while now, I've been telling people, both in videos and in my own training, that zone 2 cardio, that steady, moderate intensity aerobic work where you can still hold a conversation, was essentially the single most important thing you could do for long-term cardiovascular health and longevity. I leaned into it hard. I built training blocks around it. I recommended it to friends who asked me what to prioritize. And when I actually sat down recently and went through the newest data, the large cohort studies, the mechanistic research on mitochondrial function, and the way it stacks up against strength and against higher intensity training, I realized I had oversimplified something that deserved considerably more nuance. Zone 2 isn't wrong exactly, but the story I was telling about it, that it was the thing that mattered most, was incomplete in a way that I think actually matters for how you should be training. I want to walk you through exactly what changed my mind, what the actual research says, and what I think you should be doing differently based on where the evidence currently stands. Let me start with where my thinking used to be, because I suspect a lot of people watching this have absorbed the same message I had. Zone 2 training got an enormous amount of attention over the last several years, largely because of its clear connection to mitochondrial biology and fat oxidation, and because it's genuinely more sustainable and lower risk than high-intensity training for most people to do consistently. I bought into the framing that this specific intensity zone, roughly 60 to 70% of your maximum heart rate, where you can still speak in full sentences but not sing, was the aerobic sweet spot, the zone where your body builds the most mitochondrial density, burns fat most efficiently, and lays the physiological foundation for everything else. I built entire weeks of programming around hitting a target number of zone 2 minutes, treating it almost like a box to check, a specific number I needed to hit, 3 to 4 hours weekly in this precise heart rate range. Or I felt like I was somehow leaving longevity benefit on the table. I remember specifically restructuring my own schedule around long, slow rides and runs, sometimes at the expense of skipping a harder session entirely, because I'd already gotten my zone 2 in for the week, as if that single metric was the complete measure of whether I'd trained well. The moment that started cracking this open for me was going back through the actual cardiorespiratory fitness and mortality literature more carefully, rather than relying on the popularized summary of it that circulates in fitness content. A large study published in JAMA examined cardiorespiratory fitness, measured as VO2 max, across a huge cohort and found that low fitness was associated with mortality risk comparable or, in some analyses, exceeding traditional risk factors like smoking, diabetes, and existing cardiovascular disease. Citation, JAMA 2018, Cardiorespiratory Fitness and Long-Term Mortality Research. This part of the research I already knew well, and it's genuinely solid. What struck me on a closer read was something else. The relationship between fitness category and mortality risk wasn't simply about whether you did zone 2 training specifically. It was about your overall cardiorespiratory fitness level, VO2 max, regardless of exactly which training intensities you use to get there. And when I looked at the research comparing training intensities for improving VO2 max specifically, the picture got considerably more complicated than zone 2 is the foundation of everything. I want to walk through this research carefully because I think the nuance here is genuinely important, and it's the piece that changed my mind. Multiple studies and meta-analyses comparing high-intensity interval training against moderate-intensity continuous training, which is essentially what zone 2 work is, have found that interval training tends to produce larger improvements in VO2 max per unit of training time. Citation, this comparative efficiency has been demonstrated across multiple meta-analyses published in Sports Medicine examining high-intensity interval training versus moderate-intensity continuous training for cardiorespiratory fitness. This doesn't mean zone 2 produces no benefit. It clearly does. But it means the specific claim that zone 2 is uniquely maximally effective for building the fitness that predicts longevity doesn't hold up as cleanly as I was presenting it. If VO2 max, not the specific intensity zone used to achieve it, is what's driving the mortality benefit, then the question of which training approach is genuinely most important shifts considerably Here's where I have to be honest about a specific study that got an enormous amount of attention and that I think contributed to the Zone 2 narrative getting oversimplified in both directions across the fitness content world. A large cohort study published in BMJ Medicine that followed roughly 70,000 women and 40,000 men over multiple decades, examining links between different types of physical activity and longevity. Citation: this large cohort study on exercise variety and longevity was published in BMJ Medicine and widely covered in mainstream and fitness media. The main finding that got amplified everywhere was that doing a variety of different types of physical activity was associated with better longevity outcomes than doing just one type of activity repeatedly, regardless of how much volume of that one activity was performed. Citation: this finding on exercise variety was the primary highlighted result in the BMJ Medicine study and its accompanying press coverage. I want to be honest that when I first encountered summaries of this study, I initially read it incorrectly as supporting a pure Zone 2 framework, more low-intensity aerobic volume, more consistently, is simply better. That's not actually what the study found. It found that variety across different exercise modalities, mixing different types and intensities of activity rather than repeating the same single activity at the same intensity over and over, was the variable most strongly associated with the longevity benefit. This distinction matters enormously for how I now think about programming. If exercise variety itself, meaning exposure to different movement patterns, different energy systems, different intensities, is a meaningful independent contributor to longevity outcomes, then a training approach built almost entirely around one specific heart rate zone, however evidence-based that zone might be in isolation, may actually be missing part of the picture. I don't want to overstate this either, since observational cohort data on exercise variety carries the same limitations as any observational research, meaning people who naturally engage in varied physical activity may differ from people who don't in ways beyond the exercise itself. Socioeconomic factors, general health consciousness, access to different types of activity that could partly explain the association rather than the variety itself being purely causal. Citation needed for randomized controlled trial evidence, specifically isolating exercise variety as a causal driver of longevity, since this remains, as with much of exercise epidemiology, primarily observational rather than experimental at the population level. But even with that caveat in mind, this was a genuine crack in my previous, more singular framing of Zone 2 as the central pillar of aerobic training. Let me get into the mitochondrial biology more carefully, because I think this is actually where the real nuance lives and where I had to update my understanding most substantially. The original case for Zone 2 training rests heavily on its relationship to mitochondrial function and fat oxidation capacity. Training at a moderate, sustained intensity does appear to be a particularly effective stimulus for increasing mitochondrial density and improving the efficiency of fat as a fuel source. Citation: this relationship between sustained moderate intensity training and mitochondrial adaptations has been demonstrated across decades of exercise physiology research published in journals, including the Journal of Physiology. This part of the science is genuinely solid, and I don't think I was wrong about it existing. Where I think I oversimplified things is in treating this specific adaptation, improved fat oxidation and mitochondrial density at moderate intensities, as equivalent to the broader goal of maximizing longevity-relevant fitness, when the research on VO2 max and mortality actually points to overall aerobic capacity, which can be built through multiple different training approaches as the more directly relevant outcome. Higher intensity training also produces meaningful mitochondrial adaptations, in some respects more potent ones per unit of training time, including increases in mitochondrial enzyme activity and improvements in the muscle's capacity to buffer and clear lactate, which has its own relevance to sustained performance and metabolic health. Citation: this comparative mitochondrial adaptation research between different training intensities has been examined in studies published in the Journal of Applied Physiology and related exercise physiology literature. The honest picture, once you actually compare these adaptations side by side, rather than looking at Zone 2 research in isolation, is that different training intensities produce somewhat different complementary physiological adaptations rather than one intensity zone being definitively superior across every relevant marker. I want to dig a bit deeper into the specific mechanisms here because I think this is genuinely interesting and not something I fully appreciated before going back through the literature carefully. Interval training appears to more strongly stimulate a signaling pathway involving a protein called PGC1 alpha, which acts as a master regulator of mitochondrial biogenesis. And some research has found that intense intermittent efforts trigger a more pronounced acute activation of this pathway compared to sustained moderate intensity work of equivalent total duration. Citation, this comparative signaling research on PGC. 1 alpha activation across training intensities has been published in journals including Journal of Physiology and Cell Metabolism. This doesn't mean zone 2 training fails to activate this pathway. It clearly does, but the magnitude and time course of the response appears to differ meaningfully by intensity, which is part of why researchers have moved toward recommending a combination of intensities rather than treating either as sufficient on its own for maximizing the full range of mitochondrial adaptations available. I also want to address the concept of mitochondrial efficiency versus mitochondrial capacity, since I think this distinction is genuinely useful and gets flattened in a lot of popularized content. Zone 2 training appears particularly effective at improving the efficiency with which existing mitochondria use fat as fuel at submaximal intensities, essentially making your engine run more efficiently at cruising speed. Higher intensity training appears more effective at increasing the total number and density of mitochondria and their capacity to handle higher metabolic demand, essentially increasing the size of the engine itself. Citation. This distinction between efficiency-focused and capacity-focused mitochondrial adaptations across training intensities is discussed in exercise physiology literature examining differential training responses. Framed this way, it becomes clearer why relying exclusively on one intensity leaves something on the table. You either end up with a highly efficient but comparatively smaller engine or a larger engine that hasn't been specifically tuned for submaximal efficiency, when the genuinely optimal approach, based on the evidence, appears to involve developing both qualities together. I also want to address something specific that came up repeatedly as I was digging back through this literature, which is the concern raised in some more recent research and discussed by several respected voices in this space about whether an exclusively low-intensity approach without any higher intensity work mixed in might actually leave meaningful fitness and longevity benefit on the table for a large portion of otherwise healthy adults. Some research examining polarized training models, which combine a large volume of low-intensity work with a smaller but meaningful volume of high-intensity work, rather than either extreme alone, has found this combined approach associated with superior fitness outcomes compared to either purely low-intensity or purely high-intensity approaches in isolation. Citation. This polarized training research has primarily been conducted in endurance athlete populations and has been examined in sports medicine reviews on training intensity distribution, though I want to be clear that direct translation of these athlete-focused findings to general population longevity outcomes involves some degree of extrapolation, since much of this specific line of research was originally developed in the context of optimizing athletic performance rather than health outcomes in the general population. This polarized model is actually a big part of what shifted my own approach. The evidence increasingly suggests that the honest, well-supported picture isn't zone 2 is the foundation and everything else is optional. It's closer to a base of lower intensity aerobic work combined with a smaller, deliberate dose of higher intensity training appears to produce better overall fitness and cardiovascular outcomes than either approach used exclusively. I was presenting one piece of a more complete picture as though it were the whole picture, and I think that's a distinction worth being honest about. I want to bring in the interval training research specifically now because I think it deserves real, direct attention rather than being treated as a secondary footnote to the zone 2 conversation, which is roughly how I used to frame it. High-intensity interval training involving repeated bouts of near maximal or maximal effort interspersed with recovery periods has been shown across numerous studies to produce rapid, substantial improvements in VO2 max, often in considerably less total training time than moderate intensity continuous training requires to produce comparable improvements. Citation: this time efficiency of interval training for VO2 max improvement has been demonstrated across multiple meta-analyses published in Sports Medicine. Given that VO2 max itself is one of the strongest known predictors of all-cause mortality in the entire medical literature, with the dose-response relationship being particularly steep at the lower end of the fitness distribution, meaning moving someone out of a low fitness category produces an outsized reduction in mortality risk. Citation: this dose-response curve for cardiorespiratory fitness and mortality has been described across multiple large cohort studies published in Mayo Clinic proceedings. The practical implication is significant. If your primary evidence-based goal is maximizing the specific fitness marker most directly tied to longevity, interval training represents a genuinely efficient tool for achieving that. And excluding it entirely in favor of an exclusively Zone 2 approach may not be the optimal strategy for a large number of people, particularly those with limited weekly training time available. I don't want to overcorrect here in the opposite direction, because I think that would be repeating the same mistake with a different intensity zone. So let me be clear about the trade-offs and risks involved with higher intensity training that a purely interval-focused approach would introduce. High-intensity training carries a higher acute injury and cardiovascular event risk compared to moderate intensity work, particularly in previously sedentary individuals or those with underlying cardiovascular risk factors who haven't been medically cleared for vigorous exercise. Citation: this elevated relative risk of high-intensity exercise, particularly in deconditioned or at-risk individuals, is discussed in cardiology and sports medicine literature on exercise-related cardiovascular events. It also carries a higher recovery cost, meaning it can't simply be added in unlimited quantity without displacing recovery capacity needed for other training, including the resistance training we've discussed extensively in past videos, which itself has an independently powerful evidence base for longevity that I'd argue is actually stronger and more consistently underaddressed than either cardio intensity debate we're having today. So here's the honestly updated framework I've landed on, and I think it's considerably more useful than either my old Zone 2 centric framing or an overcorrected high intensity only framing. Zone 2, moderate intensity aerobic training, genuinely does support mitochondrial function, fat oxidation, and appears to be a particularly sustainable, lower injury risk way for most people, especially those newer to structured cardiovascular training. To accumulate meaningful weekly aerobic volume, it should absolutely remain part of a well-rounded training approach. But it isn't uniquely, singularly responsible for the longevity benefits associated with cardiorespiratory fitness, and treating it as the primary or sole aerobic training modality likely leaves some genuine, well-evidenced benefit on the table, both from the variety and longevity research and from the time efficiency and VO2 max benefits that higher intensity training specifically provides. I want to spend some time now on what I think is genuinely one of the more important and more commonly overlooked pieces of this entire conversation, which is how Zone 2 and interval training actually compare specifically on markers most directly relevant to cardiovascular disease risk, since cardiovascular disease remains the leading cause of death in most developed countries and is a huge part of why this entire conversation about cardio and longevity matters so much in the first place. Research comparing the two training approaches on markers like blood pressure, arterial stiffness, and endothelial function, the health of the cells lining your blood vessels, has generally found that both approaches produce meaningful improvements, with some studies suggesting interval training may produce somewhat larger improvements in these specific markers per unit of training time, though the evidence here remains an active area of ongoing research rather than fully settled citation. This comparative cardiovascular marker research between training intensities has been examined in studies published in the American Journal of Physiology and Circulation. Though I want to note that study designs, populations, and specific interval protocols vary considerably across this literature, making broad, confident generalizations somewhat difficult at this stage. I also want to bring in cardiac structural adaptations specifically, since this is a piece of the picture that I think adds genuine texture to the comparison. Some research using cardiac imaging has found that both Zone 2 and higher intensity training produce favorable changes in left ventricular structure and function, generally described as physiological cardiac remodeling that improves the heart's stroke volume, the amount of blood pumped per beat, though the specific training stimulus that most effectively drives this adaptation, and whether combined training produces superior remodeling compared to either intensity alone, remains an area of ongoing investigation, citation. This cardiac remodeling research comparing training intensities has been examined using echocardiography and cardiac MRI in studies published in sports cardiology literature. I raise this because I think it's a good example of how, even in a fairly well-studied area like cardiac adaptation to exercise, the research often doesn't hand us the kind of clean, singular answer that popularized fitness content tends to present. And I think being honest about that genuine uncertainty is more useful to you than pretending the science is more settled and clean-cut than it actually is. If you want to actually go deep on the full research behind everything I'm covering in this video and get a complete structured framework for building this into an actual weekly training plan rather than just absorbing the concepts abstractly, I put together a couple of ebooks that walk through this in a lot more detail. They're linked down in the description below. And honestly, if this topic is something you care about getting right rather than just watching a video and forgetting it in a week, I genuinely encourage you to go check them out. Let's talk now about the specific mechanism I think most directly explains why an exclusive Zone 2 approach might be leaving benefit on the table. For a lot of people, which comes back to something we've discussed in previous videos, the concept of functional reserve capacity. Your cardiovascular system's ceiling, meaning your maximal capacity under genuinely demanding conditions, appears to be a meaningfully different physiological target than your submaximal efficiency at moderate intensities. And research suggests these two things, while related, don't improve identically through identical training stimuli. A training approach that never challenges your system anywhere near its actual maximal capacity may be building genuine submaximal efficiency without maximally developing the ceiling itself. And it's specifically that ceiling, your peak VO2 max, that shows the steepest, most dramatic relationship with mortality risk in the population level data. Citation, this relationship between peak aerobic capacity specifically, as opposed to submaximal efficiency, and mortality outcomes has been discussed in cardiopulmonary exercise testing literature published in journals including Mayo Clinic proceedings. I think this is really the core insight that reshaped my thinking. I had been optimizing heavily for submaximal efficiency, being able to sustain moderate effort comfortably for long periods, which is a genuinely valuable, real fitness quality, while underinvesting in the specific stimulus that most directly challenges and expands the maximal ceiling that the mortality data actually points to as most predictive. These aren't opposing goals, and I don't think one should be abandoned for the other, but I was allocating my own training time in a way that skewed considerably more toward the former than the evidence actually supports as optimal. Let me also address something practical that I think gets lost in a lot of the online Zone 2 conversation, which is the question of how much of this actually matters for someone who isn't already reasonably fit versus someone who's been training consistently for years and is looking to optimize further at the margins. For someone who is currently sedentary or only sporadically active, the research is genuinely clear that essentially any consistent increase in physical activity, whether Zone 2, interval-based, or a mix, produces substantial mortality risk reduction, and the specific intensity distribution matters considerably less than simply becoming consistently active in the first place. Citation, this pattern where the largest mortality risk reduction occurs at the transition from sedentary to any regular activity, with progressively smaller marginal returns at higher activity and fitness levels, has been described across multiple large cohort studies on physical activity and mortality. This is genuinely important context because a lot of the fine-grained debate about Zone 2 versus interval training versus polarized models is happening at the margins among people who are already reasonably active. And I don't want anyone watching this who isn't currently exercising consistently to walk away thinking they need to solve this entire optimization puzzle before starting. If you're not currently doing much of anything, the single most important thing is simply becoming consistently active in whatever form is sustainable and enjoyable enough that you'll actually keep doing it. And the intensity distribution debate becomes relevant considerably later in that process. For someone who is already training consistently and is genuinely trying to optimize their approach at the margins, though I think the evidence does support a meaningful shift away from an exclusively zone 2 approach and towards something closer to the polarized model I described earlier. In practice, this looks like maintaining a solid base of lower intensity aerobic work, still genuinely valuable for the reasons we discussed: sustainability, mitochondrial and fat oxidation benefits, lower injury and cardiovascular event risk, while also incorporating a smaller but deliberate weekly dose of higher intensity interval work, specifically to target the maximal aerobic capacity ceiling that the mortality data most directly implicates, and to capture some of the time efficiency benefits that make this approach considerably more sustainable for people with genuinely limited weekly training time available. Let me get specific about what this actually looks like in practice, because understanding the research is only useful if it changes what you actually do in your training week. Current physical activity guidelines from major health organizations recommend something in the range of 150 to 300 minutes of moderate intensity aerobic activity weekly, or alternatively 75 to 150 minutes of vigorous intensity activity, or some appropriate combination of both. Citation: this combined recommendation reflects current physical activity guidelines published by organizations including the American Heart Association and the World Health Organization. What I now think this actually means practically, based on the polarized training research, is structuring your weekly aerobic volume so that the large majority, roughly 80%, is performed at that lower zone 2 intensity, sustainable conversational pace effort, while a smaller but genuinely challenging portion, roughly 20%, involves interval work performed at a considerably higher intensity, closer to your actual maximal effort. Citation: this roughly 80-20 distribution between lower and higher intensity training is a commonly cited approximation drawn from polarized training research, though I want to be clear that the precise optimal ratio likely varies somewhat based on individual training history, health status, and goals, and represents a reasonable evidence-informed starting point rather than a rigid, universally fixed prescription. In practical terms, for someone training 4 to 5 days per week for general aerobic health, this might look like 3 to 4 sessions of steady, moderate intensity work, the kind where conversation remains comfortable, combined with 1, sometimes 2 sessions per week involving structured intervals, something like 4 to 6 rounds of hard effort lasting roughly 2 to 4 minutes each, with equal or slightly longer recovery periods between rounds, though the exact interval structure that's been studied varies considerably across the research. And I'd encourage working with the actual physiological understanding rather than treating any single specific protocol as the one correct formula. Citation: various specific interval protocols have been studied with broadly similar VO, 2 max improvements across formats discussed in Sports Medicine, reviews on interval training protocol design, suggesting the general principle of including some genuinely hard efforts matters more than the precise interval length and structure chosen. I also want to walk through a couple of the more specifically studied interval formats, since I think having concrete examples is more useful than leaving this entirely abstract. One well-studied approach involves 4 rounds of 4 minutes at an intensity that would exhaust you within roughly 10 to 12 minutes if sustained continuously, separated by 3 minutes of easy active recovery, sometimes referred to in the research literature as a 4x4 protocol. Citation: this specific protocol has been studied extensively in Norwegian exercise physiology research and published in journals, including the Journal of the American Heart Association, examining its effects on VO2 max and cardiovascular risk markers. Another commonly studied approach uses shorter, more intense efforts, something like 30 seconds of near maximal effort followed by 4 minutes of recovery, repeated for 4 to 5 rounds. which has also been shown to produce meaningful VO2 max improvements, sometimes referred to as sprint interval training, given the very high intensity and short duration of the work intervals, citation, this sprint interval protocol, and its comparative effects on VO2 max and metabolic health markers has been studied in research published in Journal of Physiology and related exercise science literature. Both formats appear to produce meaningful benefit, and the honest takeaway from comparing them isn't that one specific protocol is definitively superior, but that some form of genuinely hard intermittent effort, structured in a way that's sustainable and appropriately progressed for your current fitness level, captures the core benefit that a purely moderate intensity approach misses. I also want to be genuinely careful here about who this higher intensity recommendation applies to and who should approach it with more caution or medical guidance first. If you're currently sedentary, have known cardiovascular risk factors or existing cardiovascular disease, or haven't exercised consistently in a long time, the appropriate first step isn't jumping into high-intensity interval training. It's building a consistent base of lower-intensity activity first, ideally with medical clearance if you have relevant risk factors, and only progressing toward higher intensity work gradually once you have that consistent foundation established. Citation: this graduated approach to introducing higher intensity exercise, particularly in previously sedentary or at-risk populations, is standard guidance in cardiac rehabilitation and exercise prescription literature, published in resources including American College of Sports Medicine Exercise Guidelines. I don't want anything in this video to be read as encouraging someone who's been sedentary for years to immediately start doing maximal effort intervals without appropriate progression, and where relevant, medical guidance first. Let me also address something that I think is a genuinely important piece of nuance that gets lost in a lot of the more simplified fitness content around this topic, which is that resistance training itself provides some of the cardiovascular and metabolic benefits that are often discussed as though they're exclusive to aerobic training. We've covered this in depth in previous videos, but it's worth bringing back into this specific conversation, since I think one of my own earlier mistakes was somewhat compartmentalizing cardio and strength training as though they were addressing entirely separate physiological systems. Research has found that resistance training itself produces meaningful improvements in certain cardiovascular risk markers, including blood pressure and arterial stiffness, alongside its well-established benefits for muscular strength, metabolic health, and mortality risk that we've discussed extensively before. Citation: this cardiovascular benefit of resistance training specifically has been examined in research published in the Journal of the American Heart Association. This doesn't mean resistance training is a substitute for aerobic training. The two appear to provide meaningfully distinct and additive benefits, but it's worth remembering as part of the overall picture, particularly for anyone with genuinely limited weekly training time who's trying to figure out how to allocate that time most effectively across strength, zone 2, and interval work. I want to spend some time now on the practical realities of actually measuring and tracking this, because I think a lot of the popularized zone 2 content treats heart rate zones as though they're perfectly precise, universally applicable numbers, when the actual physiological reality is considerably messier. The heart rate zones commonly used to define zone 2, often calculated using simple age-based formulas, can vary considerably from an individual's actual physiological zones, meaning the heart rate at which someone's body genuinely transitions from primarily fat-based to primarily carbohydrate-based fuel use. Citation: this limitation of simplified age-based heart rate zone calculations compared to individually determined physiological thresholds is discussed extensively in exercise physiology literature on training zone determination. More precise methods, like lactate threshold testing or metabolic cart testing measuring gas exchange during a graded exercise test, can identify an individual's actual physiological zones considerably more accurately, but these tests require specialized equipment and access that most people training for general health rather than competitive athletic performance don't have readily available. Citation needed for consumer accessibility statistics on lactate and metabolic testing availability, since this varies considerably by region and by what specialized sports science facilities exist locally. What this means practically is that a lot of people following simplified age-based zone 2 heart rate targets may actually be training at an intensity that doesn't precisely correspond to their genuine physiological zone 2. And I think this is worth being honest about, rather than presenting heart rate zone numbers as more precise than they actually are for most people without access to individualized testing. A reasonable, accessible proxy that doesn't require specialized equipment is simply the conversational pace test, being able to speak in complete sentences without significant breathlessness, but not being able to comfortably sing, which correlates reasonably well with genuine zone 2 effort for most people, even without precise heart rate zone calculation. Citation, this conversational pace approximation of zone 2 intensity, is a commonly used, accessible field method discussed in exercise physiology literature on practical training intensity assessment. I mention all of this because I think part of what happened with the popularization of zone 2 training online is that a physiologically nuanced concept got flattened into a simple heart rate number that a lot of people are treating with more precision than the underlying measurement actually supports. And I think that oversimplification is part of what contributed to zone 2 being presented as a cleaner, more singular solution than the actual research supports. I also want to briefly mention wearable devices here, since they become such a central part of how people actually try to track this in practice. Consumer wearables estimating heart rate zones, and in some cases, estimating VO2 max directly through proprietary algorithms, have become extremely popular tools for guiding this kind of training. But validation studies comparing these device estimates against laboratory gold standard measurements have found meaningful variation in accuracy, particularly for VO2 max estimation, which tends to be reasonably accurate for some devices and populations, but can be off by a clinically meaningful margin for others. Citation, this validation research on consumer wearable accuracy for heart rate and VO2 max estimation has been published in journals including Journal of Sports Sciences and Medicine and Science in Sports and Exercise. I mention this not to discourage using these tools. They're genuinely useful for tracking trends over time, even if the absolute numbers aren't perfectly precise, but to encourage treating the trend, whether your estimated fitness is moving in a favorable direction over weeks and months, as more meaningful than obsessing over the precision of any single reading. Let me now bring in a piece of this conversation that I think deserves genuine, direct attention, which is longevity-focused content creators and physicians who have become closely associated with the Zone 2 framework specifically, since I think part of my own overcorrection toward a Zone 2-centric view came from how consistently and confidently this framework has been presented in a lot of popular longevity media over the past several years. I want to be fair here. The underlying physiological reasoning behind Zone 2's emphasis in this content, mitochondrial density, metabolic flexibility, sustainability for long-term consistency, is genuinely sound science. And I don't think the popularizers of this framework were presenting fabricated or dishonest information. What I think happened, and what I now recognize in my own content as well, is a kind of narrowing that happens naturally when a genuinely useful concept becomes a popular, repeatable talking point, where the nuance and the caveats gradually fall away in favor of a cleaner, more marketable, single message: do Zone 2, get these specific mitochondrial benefits, protect your longevity. That message isn't false, but it's incomplete. And I think both content creators, myself included, and viewers absorbing this content benefit from returning to the fuller, more nuanced picture periodically, rather than letting a genuinely useful concept calcify into an oversimplified rule that stops getting critically examined. I also want to touch on something that I think is worth mentioning, given how central mitochondrial health has become in longevity-focused content more broadly, which is that mitochondrial function and mitochondrial density, while genuinely important and genuinely responsive to aerobic training, particularly at moderate intensities, are not the only relevant biological target for longevity. And I think an excessive focus on this single mechanism, however legitimate, can crowd out attention to other equally or more evidence-supported factors, like the muscular strength and functional reserve capacity conversation we've covered extensively in past videos, which I'd actually argue has a more directly established more consistently replicated relationship with all-cause mortality than the mitochondrial mechanisms specifically underlying Zone 2 training's benefits. Citation: this comparative strength of evidence between muscular strength and specific mitochondrial mechanisms as predictors of longevity reflects the broader pattern discussed across the mortality risk literature we've covered in previous videos, drawing on research including the Pure study on grip strength and mortality published in The Lancet 2015. I don't say this to diminish Zone 2 training's genuine value, but to place it appropriately within a larger hierarchy of evidence-supported longevity interventions, rather than allowing any single mechanism, however scientifically interesting, to dominate the conversation disproportionately to its actual demonstrated impact on the outcomes we ultimately care about. I want to return now to something I touched on earlier, the BMJ Medicine study on exercise variety, because I think it deserves a bit more direct unpacking, since I think it represents one of the more genuinely underappreciated pieces of research in this entire conversation. The study followed a remarkably large cohort over multiple decades, and beyond the headline finding about variety, it also found that certain specific combinations of activities were associated with particularly favorable outcomes, generally combinations that included both some form of resistance or strength building activity and some form of aerobic activity, rather than either category alone. Citation: this specific finding regarding beneficial activity combinations was part of the broader BMJ Medicine cohort analysis on physical activity types and longevity. This aligns closely with everything we've discussed in previous videos about the independent additive value of both strength and cardiovascular training. And it further reinforces why I think the honest, evidence-supported message here isn't abandon Zone 2 for intervals or abandon cardio for strength, but rather build a genuinely varied weekly training approach that includes resistance training, a base of lower intensity aerobic work, and some meaningful dose of higher intensity effort, rather than optimizing heavily for any single one of these at the expense of the others. I also want to be honest about the identity and content creation piece of my own error here, because I think it's worth naming directly rather than glossing over. There's a real pull, both as someone creating educational content and, I suspect, as someone consuming it, toward simple, singular, repeatable messages. Zone 2 is the foundation of everything, is a considerably easier message to communicate clearly and a considerably easier message to build a consistent training identity around. Then there's a nuanced, evidence-supported polarized distribution between lower and higher intensity training, and the ideal ratio depends somewhat on your individual goals and starting point. The second version is more accurate, but it's genuinely harder to communicate cleanly. And I think that difficulty is part of why the simpler version proliferated so widely across fitness and longevity content, myself included, without enough of the underlying nuance surviving the process of popularization. I also think there's something worth naming about how satisfying it feels both to communicate and to follow a single rule with a clean physiological story attached to it versus the messier, more honest reality that most genuinely evidence-based recommendations in exercise science involve trade-offs, individual variation, and areas of legitimate ongoing uncertainty. I'd rather give you that messier, more honest picture than a cleaner one that doesn't fully hold up. If any of this is resonating with you and you want the fuller, more complete breakdown of exactly how to structure a weekly training plan that properly balances resistance training, Zone 2 work, and interval training based on your specific starting point and goals. That's exactly the kind of practical, step-by-step material I've put together in the ebooks linked in the description below. I built them specifically because a video like this can walk you through the reasoning, but actually implementing it well benefits from having a structured reference you can come back to. So if you want to go deeper than what I can cover here, that's genuinely the best next step, and I'd really encourage you to check it out. Let me address one more piece of nuance that I think matters considerably, which is age and training status. Since the optimal balance between lower and higher intensity training likely shifts somewhat across the lifespan and across training experience level, for older adults, particularly those over 60, Some research suggests that higher intensity training, when appropriately medically screened and progressed gradually, can be not just safe, but particularly valuable given the steeper relationship between VO2 max and mortality risk, specifically at the lower end of the fitness distribution, a category that unfortunately includes a large proportion of sedentary or minimally active older adults, citation. This research on higher intensity training benefits and safety in appropriately screened older adult populations has been examined in studies published in Circulation and Geriatric Exercise Science literature. This doesn't mean every older adult should immediately begin intense interval training without appropriate guidance. Medical clearance and gradual progression remain essential, particularly for anyone with existing cardiovascular risk factors. But it does mean that the common assumption that older adults should stick exclusively to gentle, low-intensity activity isn't fully supported by the evidence either, and appropriately dosed, higher-intensity work can be a valuable, safe addition when introduced properly. I want to also mention something specific about menopause and cardiovascular risk in women, since this is a population where the training intensity conversation has some distinct considerations worth naming directly. The hormonal changes associated with menopause are associated with less favorable shifts in several cardiovascular risk markers, including changes in lipid profiles and vascular function. And some research has specifically examined whether higher intensity training offers particular benefit for postmenopausal women navigating this shift in cardiovascular risk profile, with some studies suggesting meaningful improvements in cardiorespiratory fitness and certain metabolic markers from structured interval training in this population. Citation: this research on exercise intensity and cardiovascular risk markers, specifically in postmenopausal women, has been published in journals including Menopause and the Journal of Clinical Endocrinology and Metabolism. This is a genuinely under-discussed piece of the broader Zone 2 conversation, since a lot of general fitness content doesn't account for how cardiovascular risk profiles and the relative value of different training approaches can shift meaningfully around this specific life stage. I also want to mention something about recovery and monitoring that I think matters practically here, since incorporating meaningful higher intensity work does require somewhat more attention to recovery than an exclusively Zone 2 approach would. Markers like resting heart rate trends, subjective sleep quality, and simply how you're responding to training week over week, whether you're recovering adequately between sessions or accumulating fatigue that isn't resolving, are useful practical signals for whether your specific ratio of lower to higher intensity training is appropriately calibrated for your current recovery capacity, rather than rigidly adhering to any single universal prescription, regardless of how your body is actually responding. Citation: this general principle of using recovery markers to guide individual training load adjustment is well established in sports science and training load management literature, published in journals including the International Journal of Sports Physiology and Performance. This is really an extension of a theme we've returned to across several of these videos, that the right amount and intensity of training isn't a fixed universal number. It depends on everything else going on in your life and your current recovery capacity, and higher intensity training specifically demands more careful attention to this than lower intensity work does, given its higher physiological cost per session. I also want to briefly touch on a concept called heart rate variability, since it's become an increasingly popular tool for exactly this kind of recovery monitoring. And I think it's worth mentioning here, given how directly relevant it is to calibrating training intensity distribution over time. Heart rate variability, essentially the variation in time between successive heartbeats, tends to be higher when your autonomic nervous system is in a more recovered parasympathetic dominant state, and lower during periods of accumulated fatigue or stress. And some research has found that using daily heart rate variability readings to guide whether to perform a planned high-intensity session or substitute an easier session instead can produce superior training outcomes compared to following a rigid, predetermined schedule, regardless of daily readiness. Citation: this heart rate variability guided training research has been published in studies, including those in the International Journal of Sports Physiology and Performance, examining daily training adjustment protocols. This isn't a tool everyone needs. Plenty of people can calibrate this reasonably well simply by paying attention to subjective fatigue and sleep quality. But for anyone who has access to a wearable device already, It's a genuinely evidence-supported way to make the higher intensity portion of this framework somewhat more individually responsive rather than rigidly scheduled, regardless of how your body is actually recovering. Let me bring this entire conversation together now into what I actually believe and what I'd recommend, having gone through this process of updating my own thinking rather than simply repeating what had become a comfortable, familiar message. Zone 2, moderate intensity aerobic training, remains a genuinely valuable, well-evidenced component of a healthy training approach, supporting mitochondrial function, fat oxidation, and offering a sustainable, lower-risk way to accumulate consistent aerobic volume, and I'm not walking that back. But treating it as the singular foundation of cardiovascular longevity to the exclusion or significant underweighting of higher intensity training oversimplifies a body of evidence that actually points toward a more balanced, polarized approach, combining a solid base of lower intensity work with a smaller, deliberate dose of genuinely challenging higher intensity effort as producing superior overall fitness and cardiovascular outcomes compared to either extreme alone. The mortality data most directly implicates overall cardiorespiratory fitness, your VO2 max ceiling, rather than time spent specifically in one heart rate zone, and higher intensity training appears to be a particularly time-efficient tool for building that specific capacity. Exercise variety itself, beyond any single intensity debate, appears to carry independent value for longevity outcomes based on large cohort research, further reinforcing why a varied approach across intensities and modalities, rather than optimization around any single training zone, represents the more genuinely evidence-supported strategy. And all of this sits within the broader context we built across previous videos, where resistance training itself carries an independently powerful and, in some respects, even more consistently established relationship with longevity than the specific aerobic intensity debate we've spent most of this video on. If there's one thing I want you to take from this beyond the specific research, it's this. I got the emphasis wrong for a while, not because the underlying science of Zone 2 training was fabricated or incorrect, but because I let a genuinely useful concept become an oversimplified singular message. And I think that's an easy trap for anyone, content creator or viewer, consuming health information to fall into. The evidence-based path forward isn't picking a side between Zone 2 and intervals. It's building a genuinely varied weekly training approach, a solid aerobic base, a meaningful dose of higher intensity work, appropriately progressed and medically cleared if relevant, and resistance training, all three working together, rather than optimizing heavily for any single piece of this puzzle at the expense of the others. That's a less clean, less easily marketable message than just do Zone 2, but I think it's the one the actual research genuinely supports. And I'd rather give you the accurate, complete picture than the simpler, incomplete version I was working from before. Before we wrap up, if you want the complete structured framework for actually building this into your own weekly routine, including specific guidance on how to calibrate the ratio between lower and higher intensity work based on your own starting fitness level and goals, all of that is laid out in more depth in the ebooks. I've linked in the description below. And honestly, if you've made it this far into the video, you clearly care about actually getting this right rather than just absorbing another surface level take. So go take a look. It's exactly the kind of resource designed to help you put everything we've covered today into practice. This video discusses general exercise and health research for informational purposes only and does not constitute personalized medical advice. If you have existing health conditions, cardiovascular risk factors, or are new to structured exercise, particularly before beginning any higher intensity training, consult a qualified physician for appropriate screening and clearance, and consider working with a qualified exercise professional to ensure safe progression, particularly if you are returning to exercise after a significant period of inactivity or have underlying cardiovascular concerns,